Another big night here in Detroit. Joining us, another participant who made a big impact on the stage. Andrew Yang is with us. Thanks so much for being with us.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
How did you feel it went tonight?
I felt it went great. It's great to be back here in Detroit. I've spent the last 9 years here as part of Venture for America, and so it feels like a very familiar home for me.
And just in terms of, I feel like in the first debate, you didn't get a lot of time. I feel like you got more time, and you certainly made a strong impression, I think, on a lot of people in the room, and I assume in the viewing audience at home. There was the line you started at. At one point, you called yourself the opposite of Donald Trump, an Asian man who likes math.
Yeah, and math is an acronym. It stands for Make America Think Harder. We have to start actually thinking about the real problems and not lapsing into the fairy tales that, unfortunately, we're being told by the current president.
Well, I think there's a lot of voices on a stage. I think yours is such an important voice because I think you're raising issues that nobody else is talking about, and you're looking at it from a perspective that nobody else is really looking at. I mean, I feel like at times you're taking a kind of a bird's eye view and saying, wait a minute, we're all just on this stage and wearing makeup and talking points and missing out on all these huge things which are about to hit us in the head.
Yeah, and spending 7 years in places like Detroit and Cleveland and St. Louis, like I saw the ground zero of what's happened to so many of these communities in the aftermath of the automation of these manufacturing jobs. And the retraining programs that were put in place were largely ineffective. When I dug into the numbers, almost half of the manufacturing workers here in Michigan that lost their jobs to automation left the workforce. And then of that group, about half filed for disability. And then you saw surges in suicides and drug overdoses and social ills.
And why are the programs so ineffective, the retraining programs?
The truth is that human beings are not infinitely malleable or adaptable. I mean, I was at a truck stop in Iowa the other week, and if you tried to sell retraining to that group of truckers, they'd be more likely to punch you in the face than eagerly sign up. Like human beings are just not widgets.
Right.
And if you think about the people you know, the people in your life, maybe your parents, and you were to say, hey, like reinvent yourself, it's a very, very tall order for many.
I would not be able to reinvent. I have no actual skill, so I could not be retrained to do anything other than this. Speaking of which, I got to take a quick break. But see, this is not a skill that's applicable in any other way. I can throw it a break. We'll talk more with Andrew Yang in just a second, live from Detroit. We are coming up on the top of the hour to 1 a.m. here in Detroit. Back with me, Andrew Yang. I want to play a key moment of Mr. Yang from the debate tonight.
Raise your hand in the crowd if you've seen stores closing where you live. It is not just you. Amazon is closing 30% of America's stores and malls and paying zero in taxes while doing it. We need to do the opposite of much of what we're doing right now, and the opposite of Donald Trump is an Asian man who likes math.
You said we need to do the opposite of what we are doing right now. In what way? What do you mean?
So Donald Trump came and said, look, there are all these problems in our communities, and so what we need to do is we need to turn the clock back. We need to bring the old jobs back. We need to build a wall. And I'm saying we need to do the opposite of all of these things. We need to turn the clock forward. We need to evolve in the way we see work and value in our society. And we need to stop trying to bring the old jobs back. We have to start putting more value into Americans' hands so that we can start creating the jobs of the future.
I thought it was so interesting. You said, and I want to make sure I don't get it wrong, about changing the measurements of the 21st century economy. What you were talking about, sort of how do we treat our kids, what family members who are working inside the home, the value that we place on that, what would that do? I mean, what would be the purpose of that, other than it makes sense and it's rational as a human being, as an economic thing? Why is that important?
It's crucial. Even the person who invented GDP 100 years ago, Simon Kuznets, said three things. He said, one, there's a terrible measurement for national well-being and we should never use it as that. He also said we should include parenthood and motherhood because they're so important. And the third thing he said was that we shouldn't include military defense spending in the calculation because it adds no economic value. So, of course, we've ignored all three of those things, and now we're writing GDP off a cliff. GDP's at record highs while our life expectancy is going down. And so if you see that this divergence is happening, then you have to line up your measurements so that it actually reflects how we are doing.
But you're almost, I mean, like, what, in Bhutan, they have a national happiness index. Is that what you're kind of talking about?
You know, so the goal is to build a scorecard, what I call the American scorecard, and GDP is still one element of it, but you also have our health and life expectancy, our mental health and freedom from substance abuse, our environmental quality, childhood success measurements. And then if someone decides to, let's say, step away from the workforce and nurture their child, that's not an economic sacrifice. That's actually an investment in our future. The same thing if there's a teacher who's doing great work in the classroom, instead of them saying you're a cost, say actually the value they're creating is massive because they might help 30 kids that year develop and become stronger. So if you change your measurements, you actually can reorganize our economy. And we have to do that because artificial intelligence coming, and it's going to be very, very tough to compete with on the numbers.
I was just talking to the Gateses, and one of the things they stress is that the best investment you can possibly make is investing in children and their education, and just in dollar for dollar, it is the best investment anybody can make.
Yeah, and this is something I didn't get to say on the debate stage, but 2/3 of our kids' academic performance is determined by outside of school factors. So that's parental time with the child at home, that's stress levels in the house, that's the type of neighborhood. And educators know this. Educators know that they can control about 1/3 of kids' academic performance, and 2/3 is determined outside of school. So if we want to get serious about giving our kids a chance to learn, we would put resources directly into the family's hands and into the homes to decrease the stress levels, get the number of words read to the kid when they're young up. And that would give our kids an actual chance to learn and our teachers an actual chance to educate.
Is that why you're talking about giving $1,000? And explain why giving $1,000.
Cash to every American. Because if you look at it, we spend by international standards a pretty good amount of money in our schools, and yet we don't see the performance improvements that we want to see. And the reason for that is that we're channeling resources into something that controls 35% of the kids' educational outcomes, and then we're ignoring the 65%, which is, again, parental time, number of words read to the child. Like, you have to get resources into the family to actually change the kids' outcomes in a meaningful way in many, many cases.
So, but I think all you're saying is really interesting. If you are president, what does that actually look like? I mean, what then are you actually
going to do?
Yeah.
All right, so here we go. The great thing is it's going to be very straightforward for me to go down the street to the Bureau of Economic Analysis and say, hey, GDP, very old and archaic, hasn't been updated in decades. So we're going to update it to the American scorecard that includes these other measurements that are incredibly important to us, make a lot of sense to the American people, put more money in the hands of families.
But if there's this American scorecard where how you treat your kids and what time you spend with your kids, the educational outcomes of them, how does that impact anybody's life?
Behavior in life.
As a society writ large.
Well, so the first thing is at the State of the Union every year, I would actually report on how we're doing by the real measurements. I'd be the first president to use a PowerPoint deck and say, look, here are the actual measurements for how our kids are doing, how our environment is developing, how our mental health is. And then you can actually invest and try and make resources. The trick, Anderson, is to try to tie corporate incentives to these measurements. So that right now, if you're a big company and you decide to do something positive in the community, it's just PR, and then you say, look at this great stuff I did. But if you can then demonstrate, it's like, hey, I made these kids demonstrably stronger, then they can actually get a tax credit for that. They can get economic credit for that. That's the only way we're going to align the incentives to our own well-being. Because again, right now, GDP and capital efficiency are heading in one direction, and our health and well-being are heading in another.
I feel like I understand only about a quarter of what you're saying, but I find that quarter incredibly interesting.
Oh, good.
Yeah, so I'm just acknowledging my own stupidity and your intelligence. I know others have a question as well.
No, well, I'm interested in the automation issue because I think there are huge things going on, and you've said so, that really almost don't get discussed in this debate. We're discussing an economy that's vanished, and, you know, we heard a lot of discussion about trade tonight. How much is employment at risk to trade policies as compared to or with automation and the threats that automation poses to jobs that exist today?
When I ran the numbers here in Michigan and in the industrial Midwest, about 80% of the job loss was due to automation and machines, and 20% was due to trade and globalization. So automation is the bigger threat. And some of the examples I use that Americans can understand, 30% of our stores and malls are closing, and it's the most common job in the economy to be a cashier or retail worker. The average retail cashier is a 39-year-old woman making between $9 and $10 an hour. So you don't think of that as an automation thing, and that it's not like a robot came into the store and started, taking orders. But if you go to the Amazon fulfillment center that is closing all these stores and malls, it's wall-to-wall machines and robots.
Can I ask a question? So the automation issue, super important. It is coming. It's not slowing down. But the question is, for the big tech, what are the sort of policy guardrails that should be put around this? I mean, you're not going to be a Luddite. You're not going to stop it.
No.
So how do you protect people? Or how do you allow them to use the technology in order to enhance themselves if training and reskilling themselves is not necessarily the answer?
There are a number of prominent technologists who've supported my campaign and embraced it. And certainly one big principle is that we all need to share in the gains. So that if you have Amazon, this trillion-dollar tech company, you have to give a tiny slice of every Amazon sale, and ideally every Facebook ad, every Google search, every Uber truck mile, and put it in our hands and help us build these economies that work in our communities.
Meaning more than universal basic income, separate from that, or is that what you're talking about?
Oh, I'm talking about universal basic income, the freedom dividend primarily, but there are other ways too. The other big issue to me that Americans can understand very directly is that our teenagers, particularly our teenage girls, are becoming very depressed and anxious because of smartphone use and social media use. And you don't have to look any further than if you go to Silicon Valley, they have a very strict no screens rule in those households, and they know the technology better than anyone.
Yeah, a lot of these tech people do not allow their children
Right.
to use it, or even they just limit it for a lot.
They use the technology to limit it.
Uh-huh.
You can have 2 hours, it's programmed in.
Yeah, so we need to try and get our arms around that technology application so that our kids aren't just getting addicted to these slot machines.
Let me just say a couple things. One is just, I cannot tell you how happy I am that you're in
He's
this
been
race.
on
No, I'm
this.
serious. I'm serious.
Man.
And the reason for
He
that
has been talking about you.
listen,
Yeah.
the reason for that is
Long
two
time.
things, and they're important things. One is, in a crisis, if you get the right answer to the wrong question, you still die. We don't ask the right question, so we spend all this time, trying to get the right answer, sometimes to the wrong question. I think when you point out, and I say this to the Black Lives Matter folks all the time, I'm concerned about the racists. I'm much more concerned about the robots. The robots are going to do much more damage to your community than the racists on any given Sunday, and we're not focused on it. So you bringing this out into the mainstream and making it part of the conversation is so important. I appreciate you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, brother. I appreciate you.
We got to wrap
Yeah,
it
yeah.
there. Mr. Young, thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Thank
Good
you
talking
guys so
to you.
much.
More to